Night falls over central Iran. The desert air is still, cold, silent. Deep beneath the mountains at Fordow, centrifuges spin in the darkness, separating atoms with microscopic precision. Machines designed to do one thing: enrich uranium. For years, these facilities have existed in a strange space between peace and war, watched by satellites, debated by diplomats, and feared by governments across the world. Then, without warning, the silence breaks. Air defense radars flare to life, sirens echo across military bases. Operators stare at glowing screens as objects streak across the sky. Cruise missiles, drones, precision-guided bombs. Within minutes, explosions ripple across some of the most heavily protected sites in Iran. Fire rises into the night above research complexes, military installations, and nuclear infrastructure. A new war has begun. But the strikes raise a question far larger than the destruction they leave behind. What exactly was the target? Iran's nuclear facilities, or the idea behind them? Because to understand what this war might change, you first have to understand what Iran's nuclear program really represents. The war that erupted that night did not appear out of nowhere. To many observers, it looked sudden, a dramatic escalation, another flashpoint in a region already accustomed to crisis. But in reality, this conflict had been building for months. In June of 2025, a short but intense campaign had already shaken the foundations of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. For 12 days, American and Israeli forces launched a coordinated series of strikes against key facilities connected to Iran's nuclear program. Targets included the heavily fortified enrichment plants at Fordow and Natanz, the very heart of Iran's uranium enrichment capability. Elsewhere, the sprawling nuclear complex at Isfahan suffered major damage. Metallurgy facilities, crucial for producing components associated with advanced nuclear technology, were reportedly destroyed. For a moment, it appeared that Iran's nuclear program had been dealt a devastating blow. But nuclear programs are not easily erased. Centrifuges can be rebuilt, facilities can be repaired, scientists cannot be bombed out of existence. And in the months that followed, intelligence reports suggested that Iran was already beginning to recover. Infrastructure could be replaced. Technical knowledge remained. So when the new campaign began on February 28th, it was not simply a continuation of the earlier strikes. It was something larger. Because this time, the objective seemed to go far beyond the machines buried beneath Iran's mountains. The new campaign quickly revealed that its ambitions were far broader than the strikes that came before it. This operation, reportedly dubbed Operation Epic Fury, was not focused solely on uranium enrichment facilities. Instead, the target list expanded across an entire network: missile production, plants, military installations, research laboratories, administrative headquarters, sites connected not just to nuclear technology, but to the wider scientific and military infrastructure that supported it. Reports suggested that the headquarters of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization in Tehran may have been hit. Elsewhere, explosions were reported near Parchin, a sprawling military complex long suspected of hosting sensitive explosive testing and research. Additional components of the nuclear complex at Isfahan were also struck. Individually, each of these sites played a different role. Some were connected to missile development, others to advanced materials research, still others to the bureaucracy that coordinated Iran's nuclear enterprise. But taken together, the pattern of strikes suggested something new. The goal was no longer simply to damage centrifuges or slow uranium enrichment. Instead, the campaign appeared aimed at something far more ambitious, not just destroying machines, but dismantling the entire ecosystem that allowed Iran's nuclear program to exist in the first place. The laboratories, the scientists, the institutions, the networks of knowledge that had taken decades to build. In other words, this war seemed designed to attack not just Iran's nuclear capability, but the very structure that sustained it. As the scale of the strikes became clearer, so did the list of objectives being discussed by political leaders. Public statements outlined an ambitious set of goals: prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, destroy large parts of its missile arsenal and the factories that produce them, weaken the networks of armed groups aligned with Tehran across the region, cripple Iran's naval forces in the Persian Gulf, and, in some statements, even force a transformation of Iran's leadership itself. Taken together, these objectives suggested something unusual, because they pointed toward two very different strategies unfolding at the same time. The first was preventive counterproliferation. This strategy is relatively straightforward in theory. If a country is moving toward nuclear weapons, military force can be used to destroy the facilities required to build them: centrifuges, fuel cycle infrastructure, research laboratories. The idea is simple: remove the capability before it becomes irreversible. But the second strategy hinted at something deeper. Instead of simply destroying nuclear infrastructure, it aimed at transforming the political system that had built it. In this logic, the nuclear program is not just a technological project. It is a product of the regime itself. Remove the regime, and the nuclear ambition might disappear with it. These two ideas are closely related, but they rest on very different assumptions. One assumes that nuclear weapons are a problem of capability. The other assumes they are a problem of political intent. And that distinction leads to a far more complicated question. Because if Iran's nuclear program is not simply a product of the current regime, then destroying facilities, or even destabilizing the government, might not change the underlying ambition at all. For many policymakers and analysts, the explanation for Iran's nuclear ambitions has always seemed straightforward. The problem, they argue, is the Islamic Republic itself. In this view, the nuclear program is inseparable from the ideology of the regime that governs Iran today. A revolutionary government, deeply suspicious of Western power, determined to project strength in a hostile international environment. From that perspective, the solution appears equally simple. If the regime changes, the nuclear problem disappears with it. Remove the leadership that insists on pursuing nuclear capability, and a different government might choose a different path. This assumption has shaped decades of policy debates in Washington, Jerusalem, and European capitals. But history complicates this argument because Iran's nuclear program did not begin with the Islamic Republic. In fact, the origins of Iran's nuclear ambitions go back to a completely different political system: a monarchy, a pro-Western government, a regime that was, in many ways, the exact opposite of the one that exists today. Long before the revolution of 1979, Iran was already investing in nuclear technology, which raises a troubling possibility. If Iran's nuclear program began under a completely different regime, then perhaps the ambition behind it runs deeper than ideology alone. To understand the deeper roots of Iran's nuclear ambitions, we have to go back to a very different Iran. The early 1970s, Iran is ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a monarch who sees his country standing at the threshold of transformation. Oil revenues are pouring into the economy, cities are expanding, industry is growing. The Shah's vision is clear. Iran will become a modern, technologically advanced power, one capable of standing alongside the world's great nations. In that vision, nuclear technology plays a central role. At the time, nuclear energy represents more than electricity. It is a symbol of modern statehood. Across the globe, the countries that dominate the international system possess advanced nuclear industries. The permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, all hold nuclear weapons. Control over the atom has become shorthand for technological prestige and national strength. The Shah understands this symbolism perfectly. He announces an ambitious plan to build a vast network of nuclear reactors across Iran. Western companies are invited to participate. Agreements are signed with European governments and American firms. But for the Shah, simply importing nuclear reactors is not enough. What matters is control over the entire nuclear fuel cycle. That means mastering the technologies required to produce nuclear fuel independently. Without that control, Iran would remain dependent on foreign suppliers, vulnerable to political pressure and international restrictions. For the Shah, such dependence is unacceptable. Nuclear capability becomes more than an energy project. It becomes a declaration of sovereignty, a signal that Iran intends to stand on equal footing with the most powerful states in the world. Then, in 1979, everything changed. A wave of protests, strikes, and political unrest swept across Iran. Millions of people poured into the streets, demanding the end of the monarchy. Within months, the Shah's government collapsed. The revolution that followed did not simply replace one leader with another, it transformed the entire political system. The Islamic Republic emerged from the upheaval, a new state built on a revolutionary ideology that rejected the Shah's close relationship with Western powers. For many observers abroad, the assumption seemed obvious. Surely the new regime would abandon the nuclear program. After all, much of Iran's nuclear infrastructure had been developed with Western assistance. The reactors, the technology agreements, the international partnerships, all were products of the Shah's modernization strategy. To the revolutionaries who had overthrown him, these projects appeared tied to a past they had rejected. And in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, the nuclear program did indeed slow dramatically. Some projects were halted. Foreign engineers left the country. International cooperation collapsed. But something unexpected happened in the years that followed. Rather than disappearing, Iran's nuclear ambitions gradually returned, not as a continuation of the Shah's program in its original form, but as something newly interpreted. The same technology, the same scientific infrastructure, yet embedded in a completely different narrative. Under the Islamic Republic, nuclear capability would no longer symbolize Western-style modernization. Instead, it would become a symbol of resistance, independence, and revolutionary autonomy. As the Islamic Republic consolidated power in the 1980s and 1990s, the meaning of Iran's nuclear program began to change. The technology itself had not changed. Centrifuges still enriched uranium, reactors still produced nuclear fuel. Scientists still pursued the same complex physics. But the story surrounding the technology was completely different. Under the Shah, nuclear power had symbolized modernization, a nation racing toward the technological standards of the West. Under the Islamic Republic, it came to represent something else entirely: autonomy, resistance, freedom from external control. Iran's leadership began to frame the nuclear program as proof that the country could stand on its own, even under intense international pressure. Sanctions, isolation, and diplomatic confrontation only reinforced that narrative. Each new restriction imposed from abroad became part of a larger political story, one in which Iran's nuclear scientists were portrayed not simply as engineers, but as defenders of national dignity. In speeches and official rhetoric, the nuclear program was described as a right, a sovereign right, the right of a nation to master advanced technology without permission from more powerful states. And once that idea took root, the nuclear program stopped being just a technical project. It became something deeper, a symbol of national independence, a statement about Iran's place in the international system, because when sovereignty becomes tied to technological self-sufficiency, abandoning that technology can feel like surrender. And in that context, the nuclear program was no longer just about energy or even security. It had become part of Iran's political identity. At first glance, the nuclear ambitions of the Shah and those of the Islamic Republic appear completely different. One regime was secular, monarchic, and closely aligned with Western powers. The other was revolutionary, religious, and openly confrontational toward the West. Their ideologies could hardly have been further apart. Yet when you look closely at how each government described Iran's nuclear program, something striking appears. Both regimes used remarkably similar ideas. Both spoke about sovereignty. Both emphasized independence. Both insisted that Iran must control its own strategic technologies. Under the Shah, these ideas were framed in the language of modernization and national prestige. Nuclear technology symbolized a confident Iran stepping onto the global stage. Under the Islamic Republic, the language changed. Now the same technology symbolized resistance against foreign domination. But the underlying principle remained the same. Iran must not depend on others for technologies that shape its future. The continuity is subtle but powerful. Two completely different political systems, two different visions of national identity. Yet both arrived at the same conclusion: mastering nuclear technology was essential to Iran's autonomy. This is why the history of Iran's nuclear program reveals something deeper than a simple policy decision. It shows a remarkable adaptability. The meaning of the nuclear program has been rewritten many times, first as a symbol of modernization, then as a symbol of revolutionary independence, but the project itself survived every political transformation, which suggests that the nuclear program may never have belonged to a single regime. Instead, it has become woven into the broader story of how modern Iran understands itself, its sovereignty, its dignity, and its place in the world. And if that is true, then destroying nuclear facilities may not erase the ambition that built them. For much of the past 2 decades, Iran followed a strategy that puzzled many observers. The country built enrichment facilities, it developed increasingly advanced centrifuges, it expanded technical expertise across a network of laboratories and research centers, yet it stopped just short of the final step. Iran did not openly build a nuclear weapon. Instead, it maintained what analysts often call nuclear latency, a position just below the threshold. In practical terms, nuclear latency means possessing the knowledge, infrastructure, and materials necessary to produce a nuclear weapon relatively quickly, while never officially crossing that line. It is a careful balance, close enough to demonstrate technological capability, but distant enough to avoid the political consequences of outright weaponization. For Iran, this strategy carried several advantages. It allowed the country to maintain a powerful form of strategic ambiguity. Rivals could never be entirely certain how quickly Iran might move toward a weapon if it chose to do so. At the same time, by remaining below the nuclear threshold, Iran avoided the immediate diplomatic isolation that often follows a declared nuclear arsenal. This posture became the center of Iran's nuclear strategy. Not a bomb, but the ability to build one, a capability held in reserve, a signal of technological strength, and a reminder to adversaries that Iran possessed options, even if it had not yet chosen to use them. But not everyone believes this strategy succeeded. In recent years, a growing number of analysts have argued that Iran's nuclear latency strategy contained a fundamental flaw. Because ambiguity, they say, does not always produce deterrence. In classical nuclear strategy, deterrence depends on certainty. An adversary must believe that a country not only has nuclear weapons, but is willing and able to use them if attacked. Ambiguity can complicate calculations, but it does not always prevent aggression. From this perspective, the events surrounding the current conflict appear to confirm the critics' argument. Despite years of nuclear development, despite expanding enrichment capacity and technical expertise, Iran was still attacked. Its facilities were bombed, its infrastructure targeted, its scientific institutions disrupted. To those critics, the conclusion seems obvious. Remaining below the nuclear threshold created vulnerability. If Iran had already possessed operational nuclear weapons, the calculation might have been very different. History offers several examples of this logic. Countries that openly possess nuclear arsenals, such as North Korea, have proven far more difficult to confront militarily. The risks of escalation become too great. From that perspective, the lesson appears stark. By stopping short of weaponization, Iran may have preserved diplomatic flexibility, but it may also have sacrificed the very thing nuclear weapons are often meant to provide: deterrence. But this argument rests on an important assumption. It assumes that the primary purpose of Iran's nuclear program has always been military deterrence, that the entire project exists mainly to produce, or threaten to produce, nuclear weapons. Yet the historical trajectory of Iran's nuclear program suggests something more complex. From its earliest days under the Shah, the nuclear project was never solely about building a weapon. It was about technological mastery, about demonstrating that Iran could participate in the most advanced domains of modern science. It was about prestige, about recognition, about a nation proving that it belonged among the technologically capable states shaping the international system. Those themes did not disappear after the revolution. They were simply reframed. Under the Islamic Republic, nuclear capability became tied to ideas of autonomy and resistance. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and international restrictions only strengthened that narrative. Each obstacle became evidence in the eyes of Iranian leaders that foreign powers sought to deny Iran access to technologies they themselves possessed. In that environment, the nuclear program became something more than a strategic tool. It became a symbol of independence, a symbol of dignity, a symbol of technological self-sufficiency in a world where access to advanced capabilities often reflects the hierarchy of global power. And when a technology carries that kind of meaning, evaluating it purely through the lens of deterrence becomes misleading. Because the nuclear project is not only about security, it is also about identity, about how a country sees itself, and about how it believes it should be seen by the rest of the world. Ironically, the current conflict may produce the exact outcome it was meant to prevent. For years, Iran's strategy rested on remaining just below the nuclear threshold, close enough to demonstrate capability, but far enough to avoid provoking a direct military confrontation. Now that calculation is being questioned. If a country can build enrichment facilities, develop advanced centrifuges, and still face large-scale military strikes, then the value of remaining below the nuclear threshold begins to look uncertain. Inside Iran, some voices may draw a very different lesson from the war. Not that the nuclear program went too far, but that it did not go far enough, because if ambiguity fails to deter attack, then only certainty might. A fully operational nuclear arsenal. The problem, of course, is that this logic creates a dangerous cycle. The more external pressure and military action a country faces, the stronger the argument becomes that nuclear weapons are the only reliable form of protection. And the more that argument gains traction, the closer the world moves toward exactly the outcome preventive wars are meant to avoid: a new nuclear power emerging from the very conflict designed to stop it. As the smoke from the strike slowly clears, the question facing Iran is no longer only about damaged facilities or destroyed infrastructure. It is about the future of the entire nuclear project. And that future could take several different paths. The first possibility is acceleration. Instead of slowing the program, the attacks could push Iran toward a much faster pursuit of nuclear weapons. The logic would be simple. If remaining below the threshold failed to prevent military strikes, then crossing that threshold might be seen as the only reliable form of deterrence. Under this scenario, Iran would move quickly to convert its nuclear expertise into an operational arsenal. The second possibility is strategic recalibration. Iran could choose to rebuild its nuclear infrastructure while maintaining the same threshold strategy it has pursued for years. The program would continue, but without openly producing a balanced nuclear weapon. In this case, ambiguity would remain the central element of Iran's nuclear posture. But there is also a third possibility: a deeper political transformation of the nuclear project itself. Because every major shift in Iran's political history has reshaped how nuclear technology is understood, not only as a strategic asset, but as a symbol. And if Iran enters a new political phase, the meaning of the nuclear program could once again be rewritten. In the end, the future of Iran's nuclear program may depend on something far deeper than centrifuges, uranium stockpiles, or damaged facilities. It may depend on meaning. Because throughout modern Iranian history, nuclear technology has never been just a technical project. It has been a symbol, one that different governments have interpreted in different ways. Under the Shah, the atom represented modernization, a rising nation joining the ranks of the world's advanced powers. Under the Islamic Republic, the same technology came to symbolize resistance, a declaration that Iran would not be politically or technologically subordinated by stronger states. The machines remained the same, but the story surrounding them changed, and it may change again. If Iran moves toward nuclear weapons, the program could become a symbol of security, a shield against external coercion. If it remains at the threshold, it may continue to represent technological independence without crossing the line into open confrontation. Or, In a future political transformation, nuclear technology might once again be redefined entirely. Because in Iran's modern history, the atom has always carried more than scientific significance. It has been a way of answering a larger question. What kind of country is Iran? A regional power, a revolutionary state, a modern nation seeking recognition in a hierarchical world. Long after the explosions fade and the damaged facilities are rebuilt or abandoned, that question will remain. And the future of Iran's nuclear program will ultimately be decided not only in laboratories or underground bunkers, but in the ongoing struggle to define Iran's identity, its sovereignty, and its place in the international order.